Hey Screenwriters. Billy Wilder, who is sort of a legendary screenwriter in Hollywood, once said that if you have a problem with the third act of your script, the problem really is in the first act of your script. And today's video is all about the relationship between the third act of your script and the first act of your script, and how you can use a process that I call the 3-1-2 method to help you write the best possible screenplay you can. So let's get started. Now, anytime I offer advice, it's always advice that I've used when I work on my screenplays, and it's always advice that's worked well for me. These are always tips and tricks that have really helped me write better, that have made my writing easier, that have reduced my stress level when I'm sitting in front of the computer typing up that script. The 3-1-2 method is something that I sort of stumbled upon when I was working on some of my earlier screenplays. Now, I actually haven't used this method on everything that I've written, but what I found is when I have used this method, those scripts have ended up being stronger and better. And in fact, the two features of mine that have been optioned both use this 3-1-2 method that I'm about to tell you about. Now, there is an absolutely intimate relationship between the third act of your script and the first act of your script. In fact, that relationship between first and third is really what makes a compelling screenplay. And it's really all about the transformation of your main character. They start off in one spot and they finish off in another spot. And through that journey, they become a completely different person. Something within them fundamentally changes. Understanding that relationship is central to writing a great screenplay, because without that transformation, without that character arc, you likely don't have anything compelling to say, you likely don't have a script that's going to engage the reader or get noticed. So the method that I use, what I call the 3-1-2 method, is all about writing the third act first, then writing the first act, then writing the second act. The reason why I do this is really simple. By understanding where your story is going to finish by writing the third act first, you then understand how your story has to start off to create as wide of a gap between first act and third act as possible, so your character's journey, your character's arc is as compelling and as strong as possible. The analogy that I like to use is that if you're going to send a rocket to the moon, you don't point your rocket to where the moon is right now, you point it to where it's going to be when you want to land. The exact same thing happens in screenwriting. If you want to write a really compelling third act, that's what you should write first. You should write the third act in terms of where you want your main character to end up at. What obstacles do you want him or her to overcome? What lessons do you want him or her to learn? What do you want them to know by the end of page 90 or page 120 that they didn't know in Act 1? By writing that third act, you then know what your Act 1 has to be, because your first act is going to be the complete opposite of your third act. In a typical Hollywood movie, your character starts off one way and ends up in a fundamentally different way. If they're selfish in Act 1, they're usually generous in Act 3. If they're cowardly in Act 1, they're usually brave in Act 3. Whatever your character starts off as, your third act is going to act as a mirror for that original view of that character. So what I usually recommend doing, and what I've practiced that has worked really well, is that when I know who my main character is and when I know what the general obstacles of the story are, when I have an understanding of the overall contour of where I need it to go, when I start writing, I write the last act first. I write the last 10 to 15 pages of a screenplay from that second turn act into the third. I write that first. I get it as solid as possible. I have the ending that I know I want that reader to feel. Whether I want them to feel happy or sad or inspired, whatever that is, I write that first. Then I write the first act. So the first act is usually the opposite of the third act. In many cases, literally, if the third act is underwater, the first act is on top of a mountain. If the third act is in space, the first act is on Earth. Once I have the third act written and the first act written, I can then write the second act. And the second act is essentially a bridge between the first and the third. The second act represents the journey that that character is going to have to take to go from the first act to the third act, to go from where they start off at to where they end up at. The challenges, the obstacles, the transformation, the dark night of the soul, all of that happens in the second act. And if I write my third act and then I write my first act, my second act almost writes itself because I know the inevitable journey that character is going to have to take to go from point A to point B. Do your homework first. Understand who your main character is, understand who the villain's going to be, understand what the theme of your story is going to be. But when you're ready to write, don't start off at page 1, start off at page 90, start at page 85. Start with the third act. Start for when everything is going to start to climax so that your character ends up at exactly where you want them to end up at. I think you'll be amazed at just how well it works in terms of helping you really create an impactful third act and in terms of inspiring you to write an even more amazing first act in terms of how you can set up themes and motifs and obstacles that will mirror perfectly in that third act. Now, if you really insist on writing as close to linear as possible, then you can absolutely do a 1-3-2 method. Write your first act, then write your third act, then write your second act. I've done that from time to time, and sometimes it works. I still don't think it works as well as writing your third act first, but if your brain is really wired to writing things in as chronological order as possible, write your first act, mirror it in the third act, and then write your second act to fill in the gap. So that's it. That's my video for my 3-1-2 method, something that served me really well. Have any questions? If you have any comments, drop them in the box below. Happy writing.